Okay, it is 11:30. Are we ready to roll?
I am.
Gabe?
Ready.
All right. Welcome, everyone, as you start coming in. Oh, and Gabe, if you could keep us large.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome, everyone. We are here and looking forward to welcoming you to an absolutely unique, unprecedented webinar on the subject of language proficiency testing and language assessment as it relates to interpreters and translators, primarily, language services in general. And it is being presented by, well, hosted by Cross-Cultural Communications. I'm Marjorie Bancroft, welcoming you here today. I'm the director and founder of Cross-Cultural Communications. But your presenters are the key. They are two industry experts that I've known, and this may come as a surprise. Gabe Cruz, I have known you since 2008. I was just parsing in my head the other day. And Bill since 2010. That is a long time that I have been watching these guys in action, right through many years in the industry, where not only were they working on language testing, research related to language testing, the standards for it. But Bill Hindle is actually still to this day chairing the ASTM. This is one of the two biggest organizations in the world, I know, for creating standards. The ASTM International Committee on Language Testing is being led by the capable leadership of Bill under many hats that he has worn. And Gabe, we got to know because we for years were working with him to test our interpreters who were taking our interpreter training. I love them because they are obsessed with language testing. They are obsessed with doing it right. So obsessed that they went off and created their own company, Parrot, in order to do it exactly as right as they believe it should be done. They're complete research nerds wanting to make sure that everything is quality driven and works. But the best of all is that they can explain things about language testing in a way that you will understand. And I want you to pass the word on. This recording will be free. It will be sent out to you. The link will be sent out in 24 hours along with your certificate and ATACUs. And you will be able to share it with anybody. Please do, please do, please do. Share it widely. There is no webinar I've ever heard of like this. Prepare to understand language testing, probably for the first time in your lives. Enjoy. You will have fun.
All right. That's okay. Thanks, Marjorie. That was quite the introduction. I've never heard anyone say so many nice things about Bill before. That was really very nice. This for
you should talk to my wife.
Don't worry, everyone. Bill will have his revenge, I'm sure, before this webinar is done.
Well, one of the things that we have to do here is tell a little bit about ourselves. Marjorie got us started. Bill doesn't like to talk about himself very much, so I figured I'd help him out here. He's a humble man, to a fault, I would say, but not he wouldn't say that. Look, Bill's done an amazing amount in his career in language testing. He's been in language testing for most of his adult life, as far as I can tell, and he knows it as well as he knows anything. In addition to being the chairperson of the ASTM Committee on Language Assessments, he's an active member in the ILR community, which is the Interagency Language Roundtable, which is the US government's kind of monthly meeting or organization on language testing. He's really done an enormous amount in testing, and I'm very happy to be partnered with him on our company together, which is called Parrot, which we started back in 2015. I spent about 20 years at Language Testing International, which is the actual testing office. That was really my introduction to language testing. And Marjorie's right. I don't know what happened to me along the way, but some maybe I was dropped in my head as a kid, but I do love language testing. I don't know if I'm a nerd of language testing. Bill is really the nerd of language testing. I'm just, I'm here. It's just with him, and but I love it, and I think that there's an enormous amount that people can learn about language testing. I know that in the past 6 years, I learned an enormous amount. I would say 6 years ago, I thought I knew more about it than I do now. And in this deck here, I think we'll go over some of it, and hopefully all of you will know more about it after the end of this. Bill, is there anything you want to add to this?
No. I'm going to let that one lie. I think you did a fantastic job there, Gabe.
Thank you very much, sir. So the first question that we like to ask is really, what is a language test? As you can see on this slide, there's a lot of different types of language tests. I don't want to go through all of them. The point of this slide is really just to show that the term language test isn't really enough. It doesn't just tell you enough of what you're about to either purchase or take. You know, there needs to be more to it. Is it a vocabulary test? Is it a speaking test? Is it a proficiency test? Is it a performance test? You know, there's all these different types of tests, and they're all completely different. You know, if you're going to be an interpreter, do you need an interpreter skills assessment? Sounds like a good idea. But do you also need a listening test or a speaking proficiency test? You know, what are the types of tests that you need? Is a TOEFL test enough of an English test for you? You know, there's a lot of different types of tests, and making sure that you pick the right test is absolutely the first critical step. There's
Gabe, do you want to just talk?
Yeah.
I know that was a long list of tests there. Could you go back that one slide for me? I think it might be interesting, folks. I wouldn't go to, like you said, let's have mercy on our audience and not go through all of them. But I think kind of the difference between performance and proficiency really briefly might be interesting. Could you talk a little bit about what's the difference between performance in a language and proficiency in a language?
Why, yes, I can.
There you go.
So proficiency tests measure real world ability, right? What you can do with the language in a real life situation. So when you're taking a proficiency test, the questions are going to be designed to simulate real world conversation or real world scenarios. In a performance test, they're going to be what we call domain specific, right? They're going to be a medical bilingual staff medical test, right? It can be specific to an industry and even a position. And then the rating level that's produced is going to be a rating level of that person's ability in that specific domain. It's very different than a proficiency test. Proficiency tests can be often used in place of a performance test, but a performance test doesn't always replace a proficiency test. Would you agree with that there, Bill?
I would 100%. And I think it's really interesting when you apply it to the interpreter field and the translator field, because there are like specific domains in which interpreters often work. So you may get people who specialize in medical interpreting who maybe should not work in a court environment, and vice versa. So the language skills there are domain specific in that they focus on a particular professional domain, court, medical, marketing, whatever escort, whatever it is, you know, the domain that they're focusing. I thought that was useful to point out. But yeah, I think that's fine.
Yeah, there's also, you know, when people first come into testing and they give us a call or they talk to us, they start out by saying, I need, you know, 4 skills of testing, right? Reading, listening, writing, and speaking, because the person could technically be doing everything. And usually what it gets down to is that they wind up doing the productive skills, right?
Yeah.
Speaking and writing. And there's a valid reason for that, right? very often, there's a lot of research that suggests a person's productive skill, meaning speaking or writing, is going to be the lower score when compared to the receptive skill, which is reading or listening. Basically, what that's saying is that it's harder to speak than it is to listen, and it's harder to write than it is to read, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure you've heard people will say, I speak a little Spanish, but I understand much more than I speak, which is very true for me. If I understand 3 out of 4 words in a sentence, I could probably put together the meaning of it. But if you asked me to create it, I wouldn't be able to do it. So very often that's just a little validated shortcut that people can take rather than spending the time and money to test all those skills. So here are the 3 different types of categories of testing, right? The first one is the live test, which is kind of the old standard, right? That's been around since the first language test that was ever created that I'm aware of was a live test. Was one of the ones was certainly the OPI by ACTFL, the oral proficiency interview. That was done in person or over the phone, and that consists of a tester interviewing a candidate on the phone or in person. What happened with that test is that it became incredibly difficult to scale, right? So as more and more people started realizing the value and the need for language assessments, the needs for testing went higher and higher, and the ability to do that testing at anything close to a reasonable amount of money became just harder and harder, if not leaning towards impossible. So what was created was this, what I call the hybrid test. You probably won't find that term anywhere else because I just made it up like a week ago. So, but what I mean by that is that you're taking it's like a little bit of the live test and a little bit of the machine scored, right? And that it's delivered by computer, but it's still rated by a live person. So what happens there is you get the convenience of computer testing.
A live person as opposed to a dead one?
As a live rater?
As opposed to a dead rater.
All the raters out there, right? All due respect to raters. But see, now you got me in trouble.
Sorry.
The convenience of an internet delivered test is incredibly significant, right? You can test people 24/7, anytime you want. And then when the test is done, the files can be sent to a live rater or to a rater to evaluate. So the amount of testing you can now do around the world becomes infinitely larger. The last category is one that I have particular, yes, Bill.
Can I really mention one very briefly? I'll be real brief, I promise. There's also live tests and internet delivered tests. There's also one significant difference which you didn't mention. The tester can play an outsized role in live tests. If you have a tester who is positive, encouraging, and so on, you might do better than a tester who reaches the end of a day. They've delivered 4 or 5 oral proficiency interviews and they're ready for a cocktail around now. They want to get off that call. So one of the downsides of live tests is also the upside. It's a human being on the end, and human beings treat people differently. So one of the downsides is you got to do a lot of training. You got to do a lot of norming to make sure that the candidate experience is exactly the same when you have 4, 5, 10, 20, 30 different testers all delivering the same type of test. But the candidate experience wants to be as similar as possible for every candidate. For live tests, that's really hard. For internet delivered tests, it's much, much easier.
Yeah, and we'll dig into a little more about that on the next slide. The machine scored testing is, I don't know if it's relatively new, but it's been around probably going back like 10 years or so, even longer. But what that is just an internet delivered test that is then computer rated or computer scored. It's definitely the least expensive option. And there are a number of concerns with that type of testing. I could go on and on and on about the amount of concerns.
Don't, Gabe.
I don't want to do that. I get very excited. I start sweating. It's not good for anyone. So I'm going to leave that be right there. And let's talk a little bit about the two main types of testing, and which are certainly the most popular, I think, in terms of interpreting and any types of high stakes situations for testing. Computer scored testing is not really used in high stakes environments. Live tests, actually, despite the fact that they're significantly expensive, right? The average cost of the live test is probably, I mean, it ranges. It could go anywhere from like about $70 to about $250. It's a very large range. And one of the, probably the biggest cost of that is actually not just the test itself. It's in scheduling the test and managing the test. That, you know, it has to be at a specific time. You know, it starts, like, for example, in order to book your test, you need to provide 3 windows of time of like 2 hours each, right? So it's a very big commitment from the tester, or from the individual, and then the tester will come back and schedule a time. It's just, it's very labor heavy. And then of course you have to be on time, and you have to worry about the candidate being on time. If they're not on time, then there's cost, and it's just, there's a lot of challenges with live testing. And of course the potential variance in tester quality, which is something Bill jumped in with early just for us.
I'm glad you anticipated my concerns, Gabe.
And it's always appreciated. The hybrid test, and you know, of course, Bill's right, and he's almost always right. But the tester plays a huge role, and when we did studies evaluating the similarity of ratings between a live test and one of these hybrid tests, the scores are incredibly high. The reliability rate is incredibly high. I think it was just under 90%. And that was done a long time ago, before you know, the demand or the use of interacting with people over the phone, conversing with various apps and things like that became so common, right? One of the things that we thought was impacting that ability to have even higher reliability was people's natural comfort level interacting with a computer and having a conversation with an avatar or something like that. So now that that's so common, we think that the reliability rate between the two tests would actually even be higher. The convenience of hybrid testing, you know, where the candidate can test at any time they want. There's no such thing as being late for a test. There's no management involved because the candidate doesn't have to come in for the test. There's all sorts of, you know, software packages that can provide security for the test. It's really a very convenient and cost-effective option. So that's why hybrid tests have really done incredibly well in terms of language testing for high stakes environments. Okay, looking at speaking tests and really any type of test in language, you want to also look at the different types of test items. You know, when you look at a test and you take a demo, right, what are you looking for, right? I mean, if you don't go in with a plan, they can kind of all look very similar, right? So it's important to know what you're looking for when you go into a demo. You know, what types of questions are they asking? You know, and there are, you know, for example, the parrot test, what we do is use all role plays, right? That's just the way it's done. It's not any better or worse, in my opinion, for today. I'm a neutral person. But the other tests out there very often use standard question and answer. You know, what's your name? You know, you like playing basketball. Tell me about the last time you played basketball. You know, role play scenario would be like, tell me about a Or I'm going to pretend I'm a hotel operator and you pretend that you have an issue with your room. Give me a call and tell me what's wrong with your room and ask me to book you a new room. You know, again, these are proficiency test types of questions. So we're asking the candidate to act out a situation that can be commonly found in the real world, right? Because we're trying to measure real world ability. So looking at the types of questions is a very important part of that. And which types of questions you'd like to see is entirely up to you, and which ones you think is better is entirely up to you. The delivery of the test, is it a phone delivered test, which some tests are? There are advantages to both, right? Is it a phone delivered test or a computer delivered test? Both provide on-demand testing. With the phone test, the questions are pre-recorded, right? But instead of having an avatar or videos or graphics to deliver the questions, it's just a recording, which is okay. You know, it's up to you. Again, if that is a format that you're comfortable with and that you think is appropriate for your specific needs. There are, you know, different tests, but they all really range in about that 20 to 30 minute length. Some do go as high as 40 minutes, and those tests are the ones that cover a wider range of ability. And that's something we're going to look at a little more in depth in terms of measuring that ability right after Bill gives us another piece of information. Tell us what you got, Bill.
Oh, I'm gonna show you what I got.
This is gonna be good.
I don't know about that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the difference, not a difference, but one of the reasons that role play and standard Q&As are important. And I will go into it a little bit later when we talk about sort of rating scales. But one of the defining criteria of the higher levels of language ability is to extend your ability to speak beyond yourself and your own experiences, and talk about the world and things that are not personal to you. So if you're doing standard questions, tell me about the last time you went on vacation, or tell me about the last time you played basketball. That was never. I've never played basketball, but it's about me. And that's good and it's important, but those are typically lower level proficiency tasks. The higher level ones require you to talk about something beyond yourself, something about the world, something about politics, something about current events, something about, it will require you to interpret the world beyond what happens to you. And that's where I think role play questions become almost essential to integrate into the test if you're going to test at higher levels, because you need to be able to talk about things that are not directly personal to you.
So looking at the frameworks, and this is, by frameworks, we mean rating scales. There are three main frameworks that are really used. There are others out there, but the three main ones out there are the ILR scale, which is, again, the United States government's proficiency scale. That is the most common proficiency scale in the United States. There's the ACTFL scale, which is second to the ILR scale in terms of usage in the United States, but ACTFL is certainly a very well-known and very well-regarded scale. And then there's the Common European Framework, which is the CEFR scale, which is Europe's proficiency scale. The ILR scale was developed, I think it was after World War II in the 70s. And it was developed after the war and after the government realized that developing language skills was absolutely critical to the defense of the United States. So they realized that they better create some sort of scale in order to identify people's ability that can be consistent throughout the Department of Defense. And that's where the ILR scale was developed. And then they realized that there was no way to, or that they had a test basically everyone coming out of academia, because there was no way to identify someone's ability on the ILR scale when they were coming out of school. They weren't taking ILR tests. So what they did was they contracted, or they gave a grant to the Modern Languages Association, which is what ACTFL was spun out of, I think just around the same time, or maybe a little later, but they gave them a bunch of money and asked them to develop a new framework that would kind of bridge the gap from academia to the Department of Defense. And that's how the actual proficiency guidelines came to be. And that's why the actual proficiency guidelines are more delineated at the lower level, while the ILR scale is more delineated at the higher levels. You know, they kind of fit like that. Isn't that, that's a good illustration for you? You got it now. There you go. And you can clap at the same time. It's a wonderful trick. Bill will dig in more to this a little later, but basically what I'm trying to say is that the ACTFL and ILR scales kind of meet in the middle, with the ILR scale being at the top and the ACTFL scale being at the bottom. I'm going to move on from my graphics now. The Common European Framework is also at the more heavily weighted towards the top. And Bill will break this down a little more as we go through it. One important thing to note about the scale, and this, I think, a lot of people kind of get stuck on this, right? That, you know, moving up from, say, a novice low to a novice mid, or a novice high to an intermediate low, or which is the ACTFL scale, or moving up from a 1 to a 1+ on the ILR scale, is not the same as moving up, say, from an advanced high to a superior on the ACTFL scale, or 4+ to a 5 on the ILR scale. The higher you go on those scales, the broader the jump is from one level to the next. And that's why this little guy here, he's going to have a hard time getting up to level 3 and then 4 and then 5. It's just the levels are so broad. You know, one of the things that is always kind of humorous to me is when you look at a language test, and there are so many out there now, but some of them are actually scored, proficiency tests are scored on a point scale of 1 to 100, right? And that's the easiest sign that there's something amiss here, all right? Because how on earth do you validate someone being a 84 and someone being an 85? What on earth is the difference between the two in terms of their actual real world ability? You know, the only way these tests can make sense, the only way they can work, is by having very broad levels. You know, it's critical to having a reliable test. And Bill certainly knows a lot more about the scale than I do, so I will let him jump in and correct anything I said. If he wants to use my hand graphics, he's welcome to. Those were new to me today. I'm very excited about them, so feel free to use them, Bill.
I know. I actually thought you were doing a sort of a pandemic era sanitizing motion.
No. This is high level. This is
high
low
level, and this is low level.
This is the mid.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you can break it for a clap.
I like it, Gabe. I think that's going to be. You've contributed a lot to the language testing industry over the years, but I think this crowd today just witnessed you do your biggest contribution to the language.
I think you might have competition for chairperson of the ASTM committee, so I'm just letting you know.
So let me talk a little bit about the scales, and I won't go on too much because I'm a nice guy and it is incredibly dense and boring. But the fundamental thing I want you to take away from this slide, if you take away anything, is at the top there. It's monolingual. So I know Marjorie mentioned earlier that most of the people on this call will be interpreters or translators. Being monolingual doesn't really help you to be an interpreter or translator, right? But the proficiency scales only measure your ability in one language. So they're not, the ILR and the actual proficiency scales don't tell you about how you can work back and forth between languages. They just tell you about how well you speak the language being tested. So there's no congruity judgment involved in there. There's no knowledge of interpreter ethics or anything like that. It's just how well you can speak the language. The ILR scale has long sort of verbose descriptions, but I think the most important part is at ILR 3. It's a 5-point scale, 0 through to 5 with pluses, but only at level 3, which is general professional proficiency, does the ILR suggest that you have the language capability needed to begin to function as an interpreter or a translator. That ILR 3, the middle of the ILR scale, so here on Gabe's hand, right here, that's the top of the actual scale. The actual scale doesn't cover the higher levels of the ILR scale. It only covers the lower levels. I put down briefly the things there, but it's too obtuse. So let's just go through here. And hopefully from this slide, you'll get an idea of if language were cooking, what could somebody create at each level of proficiency? All right. So if you could move, all right. So level 0, 0 cooking ability, none. I can maybe combine foods. Level 1, I can prepare some dishes. For example, I can prepare food. It is cooking, right? Technically speaking, warming food up is cooking, but it's not really very good. But that's level 1 on the scale. Level 2, hey, now I'm starting to cook with real gas, right? I can actually do some recipes such as I can combine ingredients. So I could take my little web-based, food.com recipe and create something. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. 3, remember on the slide before, I bet you don't remember because it's boring, but 3 is general professional proficiency. The important word is professional there. At 3, you have to be able to do things that ordinarily I don't do when I'm cooking for my family or friends. I'm just preparing something that I like. At ILR 3, I'm a caterer already. I can cater for small groups. That's not what people do every day in the kitchen, right? So the ILR 3, or the actual superior scale in proficiency, it's really important that everybody understands that's beyond what most people do every day. 3 is catering. Now, on the ILR scale, let's look at 4. 4, I'm a chef. So I'm way better. I don't know what percentage of people that cook are chefs. It's got to be a vanishingly small percentage of people. Most people every day in the language are not chefs, in the language or in the kitchen. 5 is a master chef. I've never had the sort of pleasure of eating in one of those restaurants. But here's what you can do. You're good, Gabe. Go on to the next one. At 0 cooking ability, so at 0 on the ILR scale, we skipped 0. But 0, you can't do anything, right?
No, 0 is here. Oh, just go.
0 is bread and butter. You're not cooking anything. You're not warming anything. You're just putting butter on bread. It's like an English sandwich, right? American sandwiches are really good. I'm English. English sandwiches, bread, butter, and a little bit of ham. You're done. Nothing else. ILR 1, you can start to make things, but you're still not going to really have much fun here. You can boil some spaghetti and you can add Prego sauce, but you're not making this from scratch, remember. You're doing it, you're just assembling ingredients. At 2, you're starting to make things yourself. You're starting to take raw ingredients, put them together, and make something new out of those ingredients. You make a hamburger out of it, you can make whatever you want there. This is the level at which interpretation or translation becomes possible, is ILR 3. You start doing lobster beef. These are not things that I ever cook for myself. And I would think that, so a test at which you are rating at ILR 3, you are really, really good in the language to rate at ILR 3. Even though it's a 5-point scale, it's only in the middle of the scale. ILR 3 is really strong. ILR 4, this is a meal that I had a long time ago, and still remember. But most people don't do this. Not most people. Nobody does this in their kitchen, right? So when you transfer this to language, you've got to start thinking about proficiency scales as if you get a 3 or a superior on 3 is the ILR scale, superior is the actual scale. If you're getting a 3 on there, you're really, really good. You have a general professional ability to function in the language. All right, Gabe, scoot on to the next one for me. So I think this is my last slide, and then I'll hand you back into Gabe's capable hands. So far, we've been talking, remember, about monolingual proficiency. Those are the ILR scales for speaking, listening, reading, and writing, and the actual scale, they're monolingual. The ILR also has a scale for interpretation. And although it's a 5-point scale, I took this quote from the document itself. It's only at 3 that it's all the necessary skills aligned to enable a reasonably accurate, not entirely, just reasonably accurate, reliable, and trustworthy interpretation. But the important, I think it's important you understand that the middle of the scale is still good. But the most important thing to take away from this is that proficiency is monolingual. If you're going to do interpretation assessments, then you need a different scale, and you need the ILR scale for interpretation, not proficiency, because it's not a one-to-one correlation. You can have ILR 3 speaking skills in 2 languages, two separate tests, and you could be a lousy interpreter. Just because I have a camera, I'm not a photographer. Just because I have a pen and pencil, I'm not an author, right? So the ability to speak the languages is required of an interpreter, but it's not sufficient in and of itself. There are lots and lots of other skills that need to be tested if you're going to give a rating on the interpretation scale.
So, just to recap, I thought I was a pretty good cook, I must say, but I'm definitely not. I mean, the 3 is pretty high. I mean, so Rob, what was that?
So,
I mean,
if I may, so I have a colleague who was actually there at the start of the development of the ILR scale, a gentleman called Pardee Lowe, fantastic gentleman. But he maintained that most of native speech every day, most of the speaking that we do in our daily lives is at the 2 or 2+ level. So even though we may be capable of more, what we do every day is at the 2 or 2+ level. We very rarely have to push our language, even as a native speaker, to push our language to the 3 and beyond, because it's not required in many day-to-day situations. It only becomes required when you have to challenge yourself to do tasks that require that kind of language skill.
My understanding is on the actual scale, most conversation takes place at the advanced, low, even intermediate, high levels.
Yeah.
So that's consistent with what I know. So that means you're right, obviously. I thought we'd include some examples of the different types of tests. And there are, of course, many other options for each one. This is by no means saying that these are quality tests or these are tests you should look at. These are just examples of tests that we consider to be, well known. So for the live test option, the OPI, which is a ACTFL test, that is $165, including that remote proctoring piece that allows the candidate to test on their own, basically, and that's rated on the ACTFL scale. I'm actually not going to read these, but what you can see here is that the live test options are more expensive than the hybrid test options, which are more expensive than the machine scored test options. The machine scored test options, one important thing to note there is that they're often rated on native scales. right? They're not using the actual scale, the ILR scale or anything like that, because the way that they're evaluating communication, especially in speaking, which these are all speaking tests, is just very different. All right, they're almost always actually taking speech and converting it into text, and then using the machine scoring algorithms to evaluate written speech. But that leaves a lot to be desired for a number of reasons that I'm not going to get into. But the machine scored testing is undoubtedly where the world is headed for probably everything. But if you want to use one of these tests, I would encourage you to really look at the data on the tests and how well they perform at the upper levels of ability. My understanding or my opinion is that they do very well at the lower levels of ability, but when you start to get into those higher levels, that's where things get a little more difficult. So as with any test, look at the research before making a decision. You know, I would never suggest you take a company's word for it when they say, my test measures language, measures speaking proficiency, and does so reliably. It's incredibly important that you look at the data so that you can see for yourself how that test works, why that test works, and actually how well it works. You know, not every test is going to be the same. Developing a test costs a lot of money. You know, it's not cheap. I can speak for my own self when I said, you know, I thought I knew more about testing, you know, about 7 years ago. That was because that was before we tried to start Parrot and made every mistake possible. And I knew a lot about testing then. It wasn't that we didn't know how to do it. It's just that, you know, I think confidence can get in the way, and money can be an influencer, but there really is not a shortcut. When it comes to developing a language test, there is absolutely a science of testing. And that's really what I love so much about testing, is that there's so much more than meets the eye. You know, there's a whole world going on behind the scenes of every question. You know, what the question is, what it's asking, where in the test it's placed, who's rating it, like all of this activity going behind the scenes. Bill raising his hand. Bill is also a big fan of the science of testing and loves to talk about it, right? Doesn't like to talk about himself, but the science of testing he loves to talk about. So please, Mr. Hindle.
This is going to be about myself. Because the science of testing, I hate to. I like that. I'm just talking now because I like the sound of my own voice, actually.
Well, Bill, if I may just intervene for a second, we do have a lot of questions coming up, and then they are important. Yeah. And it's 12. I mean, it's 2 minutes before.
Okay.
I mean,
I got it.
We love it.
We'll move on.
Great positive feedback. So just to let you know.
Okay, not a problem.
Not just.
But we're good. Look, before choosing a test, all right, make sure that you look at the studies, that you look for rating reliability, how well the test performs in an independent study. An independent meaning that, you know, it's not look, they're all going to be paid for from the companies because no one else is going to do it for free. But it's important that the academic or that the researcher, in my opinion, again, is has a strong affiliation to an academic institution, and ideally is not a corporate for hire researcher, because, you know, that's the easiest ones to buy. In an unpopular opinion, but from all of us on the consumer side, we all know that's true, right? So looking at the study, who's conducting the study, the reliability stats, it's incredibly important. Testing for the interpreter community, you know, this 5 E's of professionalism, it comes from an academic journal that describes what kind of what professionalism or what a profession is. And testing, if you look, education, ethics, experience, entity, and what's the last one? Examination. Well, that's a nice one. That's all kind of tied to testing. And just so everyone's aware, the best practice for interpreter testing, you start with a proficiency test, and then you take an interpreter skills assessment. You know, someone who speaks Spanish and English at a very high level doesn't necessarily make a good interpreter. And someone with good interpreting skills doesn't mean they have the necessary proficiency level to actually be an interpreter, say in the medical community or the legal field. So it's important to have both. And one added benefit is the proficiency test is much less expensive than an interpreter skills assessment. So the proficiency test serves as like a screening tool for the ISA. It's just an important way to not only control quality, but to control cost as well. This is the NBCMI and CCHI approved proficiency or stats on the proficiency component of the national certification. All right, they accept these 3 tests, and these are the scores. It's a 2+ on the ILR scale and advanced mid on the ACTFL scale. This is all public knowledge. This is, Bill, you want to jump in here on the ASTM real quick?
I think we've talked about it. The ASTM is putting together a standard guide for people who are interested in language testing. It's in review now and hopefully will be published this year. No, we're nearly at the end of this year. It's going to be January before it gets out there. But the important part was just what Gabe said about screening tests to identify people who may make good interpreters. The only way you can identify a good interpreter for sure is to test their interpreting ability.
So the main things, right? Hopefully walking away from this, everyone knows that before you look at either testing yourself or bringing a test into an organization for other people, make sure you know what skills need to be tested, right? That's a critical component, obviously, a good first step. Then to actually make sure you're comfortable with the framework that the test is going to be rated on, and making sure that the integrity of the test is protected. This is either through proctoring software or through actual test centers. But that's a critical piece of looking at a test. And then, of course, the validation studies and the types of questions used. If you cover these 5 steps in looking at a test, you will be very likely to have a positive outcome with any test. So I think that is the end. See that? Thank you. I wrote the slide that said thank you. All right. So, and we do. We thank you for joining in. This is very important to both Bill and I to try and share as much about testing as possible so people make the right decisions when looking at language tests for themselves or others. Okay, Marjorie, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, please, so I can ask you the zillion questions. I first want to start off by saying we've had tons of appreciative comments, and I'm so glad about that because it shows that you have hit a chord. You were communicating comprehensively. People loved, there were so many comments about the cooking analogies, Bill, I can't even tell you, including one that said, fair warning, I'm stealing this for future workshops, presentations, talks. Hopefully, Janice, that's with full attribution if you're listening. And you may be spreading the word via interpreters and not just as recording, Gabe and Bill. So without further ado, let's jump to the questions. Someone wrote, I would have thought the receptive skills need to be primary. If not engaged in bilingual interpretation, the productive skills are secondary or production.
I'm not quite sure I followed that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Maybe my receptive skills are a little on the weak side.
Well, I guess it has to do with this confusion between the monolingual side of testing versus the bilingual side of performance, and maybe that's where the confusion is, because I'm also a bit confused by the question. but production
Well,
skills.
I can answer what I think is the important part here, which is so there are many different types of interpretation and some or transcription, for example, in which case you have to listen to utterances in one language and then write them in a second language. You never actually have to produce in spoken format. There are agencies out there with 3 letters in their name that of which we do not speak. That's all they do. Linguists for those agencies just listen and then either gist or verbatim write out what is said. You don't need productive spoken skills there. So it all really depends on what the end result you're trying to predict performance on, as to whether you need to test those listening skills and such.
Got it. Thank you, Bill. This question is, what can we do with languages that can't be tested? How can we start the process? I don't think you have a happy answer to that question.
Well, yeah. Gabe, do you want to take it? Or
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of languages that aren't tested. There's far more languages that aren't tested than are tested. But if you absolutely need a rating or an analysis of someone's ability, the best way to go about it would be to find speakers of the language, I think, that are that you can kind of trust from one way or another, either through education or experience or some way that you can trust their level of ability, and try and bring them into the world of language assessments. Let them familiarize themselves with a set of criteria, and have them interview. I would have at least, ideally, 2 people that can interview the candidate. A lot of times, the reasons that tests aren't developed in these other languages is because there's not enough demand for them. We did a test for Marshallese once, which is spoken in the Marshall Islands, which is incredibly difficult. The internet was only available from like 2 to 4 each day. And it was just very difficult. And it was for the United States government. It was the only one who would ever pay for something like that. But it's what you do is you find people that you're confident can speak the language, and then try to bring them into some sort of criteria, and then introduce them to the candidate and try to. That's the best you can do. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing.
All right, thank you. We'll see what happens. It's a big question around the world when you think that there's almost 7,000 languages in the world and very few language proficiency tests. Would you, next question, include an English proficiency test within the same testing window for an interpretation skills test? I know what my answer would be. I'm very curious about your answer.
You want me to answer?
Yeah, go ahead, Gabe. Here's that bus coming down the road. I'm gonna suggest you
I
go
just
under
like
it.
Bill to tell me that he wants me to answer. That's all. I believe that there should be a little cooling off period between tests, but I don't think there is a standard. Well, I know there's no standard for, there should be 2 weeks of separation between tests. It's really up to the different organizations and their comfort level as to, if you want to test both the proficiency test and the interpreter skills assessment in the same window. But I would give a little space just because you want to worry about test taker fatigue.
Yeah, and I would just add that part of the reason to do a screening test, which, as Gabe mentioned, is almost always significantly cheaper than an interpreter skills assessment. Why you would jam them together and pay for both if you're going to do the screening test and they fail miserably? There's no point in doing the interpreter service. It's actually ethically one of the you really shouldn't have people take tests that they're going to fail, because it's a painful, horrible experience, right? So I would certainly find the. I did another hand motion there, didn't I? So we've done this. We've done this. So I would get the results of the proficiency assessment first and use that to determine who is more likely to do well on an interpreter skills assessment.
Thank you. Someone writes, I was disappointed with the test I took. When we went to do the role play, the proctor hadn't been in the country of the language for 25 years. He had no clue. That affected my score because he didn't know modern terms that are common now and thought I was making up words. My question to you about that comment would be, do you think that's a common issue with raters? Is it something to be concerned about?
I mean, this is what Bill spoke about earlier when he was saying the potential impact of rater or tester quality. We call them testers, the person that's delivering the test, and then the raters are the people who only rate the test. So tester quality is largely dependent on the person, right? And it's one of the reasons why organizations really should, when delivering live tests, spend an enormous amount of time and money training those people. There's no shortcut to that. But the test should be double rated, which means that there should be another rater behind you, which is unlikely to have that same kind of weakness or concern of yours, so that even if that was something you experienced in your test, you still should be covered in the back end. It should not affect your experience or your outcome, sorry.
Yeah, and Gabe, that is precisely one of the reasons why my training agency, we're not a testing agency, we're a training agency, but when we're training interpreters and test them for the 40-hour program, we would always get the double rated test. So
I would not use
big
a
supporters.
Single rated test. I would not use a single rated test.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree
dangerous.
more.
Yeah.
Most of us take the test. This may be out of your bailiwick a bit. Most of us take the test that is required for certification as a medical interpreter or a legal interpreter. Who is in charge of selecting the appropriate test? Sometimes the most popular test is not the best for the certain interpreting role. To me, this question, Gabe and Bill, reflects a bit of a lack of understanding between language proficiency testing and testing that involves terminology in language-specific domains of professional interpreter specializations. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, the bigger picture question, but this is a reality in our field. As you know, people are being asked to take tests that might be created for medical interpreters or created for legal interpreters, or that might just be general language proficiency tests, and then you take the performance test. Which approach do you recommend, or what comments do you have?
Go ahead, Gabe.
So the test for the interpreters, you're saying that the organization that's testing them would test them with a test that's, I think, was not the desired test. Is that right? That it was a
like, for example, instead of going to an established generic language proficiency test,
right,
they might
use, like,
request one
test
that has some medical terminology thrown in.
Oh, I see.
Or some legal terminology thrown in, because basically the interpreter or translator has no control over the test that's chosen by a specific hiring entity, whether that is a court, a hospital, a language company. They just have to take whatever test they're given, right?
Yeah,
but I mean, this questioner knows that that doesn't sound right. You know, I think you.
Yeah, I mean, look,
agree.
I can tell you that in my experience, you know, and this is going back now about 22 years of doing this, I've run into countless organizations that are using a test for their candidates that make absolutely no sense. I mean, shockingly no sense. Like, and these are not, it's not that the person isn't intelligent or something like that. These are very intelligent people that make sound decisions that just made a mind-boggling decision. And, you know, there's on our side, we can only try to encourage them to kind of see the light. But from the candidate's perspective, the only thing that I could recommend is in order to try and avoid the surprise of that situation, is to try and get as much advanced knowledge as you can of the test, and then to do your homework on the specific type of test that they're delivering, and then to give your feedback to the organization on what your experience was. Because in most cases, the people making decisions for tests, in my opinion, maybe, let's be generous and say 50% of them have actually taken the test. All right, the other 50% don't really know what's on the test. They were sold something or told something, and maybe it wasn't accurate. Maybe they don't even know what's really on the test. So your feedback would be very important to them.
And just getting the word out about everything that you have all learned by listening to Bill and Gabe today, including we had so many questions, Gabe and Bill, about, do we get the link? Do we get this recording? Do we get this recording? This is really valuable information. And so, Andrew and I are reassuring everybody that yes, they will get the recording. When you get about 24 hours from now, when you get the link to the recording, it will also come with a link to the PowerPoint. Thank you, Bill and Gabe, for sharing that as well, and the link to your certificate. But that shows a real interest, but the comments also showed how much they enjoyed your presentation. And this is not something we usually get. We usually get the thank yous. This is really valuable content. This is important information. We got all of that for this too, but people clearly also had a lot of fun with you. And definitely, one even commented, do we have a gala dinner at this end after the cooking analogy? And one commented, there are many more superior of us than there are master chefs around. There were people who were engaged. They were paying close attention. And I just want to thank you. I mean, I knew that would happen because I know you too. I think people also appreciated the back and forth that you two have. Thank you so much. I want to tell you, Gabe and Bill, I forgot to mention, I stay on afterwards. It's a tradition just to answer questions related, to what we do in CCC and interpreting and just generic questions. But as you can see from the chat, as we wish you a fond farewell for now, there are tons of thanks just pouring in as we speak, and I'm sure people will spread the word about the recording. Thank you so much, both of you.
You're most welcome. Can I, Marjorie, just before you turn off the recording, the cooking one, I need to thank Rachel Brooks at the FBI for that. If it's attributed, I stole it, so you can go ahead and steal it from Rachel.
Okay, well, we need to find her email and send her a big thank you.
There you go.
So thank you,
use the sentence,
Rachel
I stole from the FBI. That's all.
So we have to delete that sentence from the recording. Absolutely.
Leave that one out.
Absolutely. Okay.
But
well,
thank
you,
you,
Gabe and Bill.
Andrew.
Take
Thank
good
you,
care. Have a
everybody,
wonderful
for
rest of
tuning
your
in.
day and week.
Yeah. Take care. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
So everybody, as is the tradition, our fond tradition at CCC, I'm staying on just to answer not questions about big questions about language proficiency testing. I do know some basic things for sure, but about and by the way, questions about our webinar series, about CCC, about interpreting, not so much translation, thank you. Decades ago left the field of translation. But I do want to reiterate, you will get the recording, you will get the PowerPoint. You will also have an opportunity, like if we couldn't, as always, answer all the questions, but if there was a burning question that you had, you can email us at CCC, just info@cultureandlanguage.net. Andrew's usually very good about typing that in the chat window. And I do just have a couple of comments. Someone asked, would you include an English proficiency test within the same testing window as an interpretation skills test? A lot of the answer from the interpreter training perspective would depend. Is this someone you're hiring right now as a bilingual employee for, someone you want to train as an interpreter? Because the idea is that you would do language proficiency testing first to see if they're bilingual enough to interpret, then give them the training or even more advanced training, and then test their interpreting skills. There's no point in testing their interpreting skills before you've given your training. And some language companies do this. They'll give the interpretation skills first or even give it during the training, but you really need a window between the test, the training, if they're getting training, and ultimately the interpreting skills test. I also want to reiterate that what they said, which is there's really no point in giving an interpreting skills test or certification if they haven't had a language proficiency test to show that they're sufficiently bilingual in the first place. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, it's very stressful for participants. Somebody's also asking where reliable validation studies can be found. Reliable validation studies for what test? Every test has to have its own validation studies. Gabe and Bill founded Parrot. Parrot is still actively conducting validation research. It's very expensive, it's very complicated, they're very committed, and they have, well, actually they have done it, and now they're in the process of consolidating all that data, and they've done it before, and they will do it again, because validation is kind of an ongoing process. So I'm going to say, what is the best way to self-test? Any tools online? That's a really good question. I know that the National Center for State Courts used to have practice tests for certification skills testing, because certification is like, in our field, it's like the ultimate skills test, right? But for language proficiency testing, the only thing I ever saw was kind of a toolkit for self-testing, and I would have to get my hands on that. Again, it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. And then the Center for Applied Linguistics used to have tools on exactly this issue. So you can Google them. I haven't asked in a million years, so you'd have to find out if they still offer that. I love this question, Alma Enright. Why don't you share this info with all the interpretation and translation organizations to set a standards for all of us nationally and or internationally? Yeah, it's a big frustration of mine that in the language industry, we do not adequately understand language proficiency testing. I'm, you know, a linguistics nerd, so it comes more naturally to me to care about these things. But remember, you can spread the word. The link to this recording is coming to you. You can share it with anybody. It will be free just as it is to you. They can listen to the recording and they can spread the word. Oh, somebody was asking them on their thoughts on back interpretation for interpreting skill assessment, please. They're not interpreting specialists, James. This question came from our dear, wonderful James Plunkett. So I don't know if they would have answered that question, but it's, you know what a lot of us think about back interpretation. It has a lot of problems. We shouldn't go there. How can you study to get a good grade in the OPI? At CCC, we get that question a lot. We actually recommend that if you are an interpreter and you want to take an OPI, or you did take an OPI and you didn't get the score you wanted, first of all, wait 6 months. There is no point in taking another test in 2 weeks. Second, we actually recommend community college classes. If they have advanced classes in the language, that's fine. But if it's an English test, because most interpreters, English is not their native language in this country, not all, there's many native English speakers who are interpreters. But if your weaker language is in English, then taking almost any community college class, which are a lot cheaper than university classes, will improve your oral proficiency in general. If you participate actively with other students in class, engaging with the material, doing all your assignments, it's for cost effectiveness, probably better than almost anything you can do to get to that sort of that superior or ILR 3 level, or at least 2+, because in our world, we accept advanced high act full or 2+, even though ideally it should be that professional level 3 that they were saying. The reality in our field is we're just not there yet. Until interpreters are paid more, we can't demand that they be there. Other questions? Oh, wow. Someone said, I think every candidate is also afraid of that the proctor has an accent. That's a legitimate concern. I wonder if it's becoming more common. Wow. I'm a French interpreter, and French is a common language, which is true. However, language-specific certifications are scarce. Do you have any recommendation? Well, I'm not aware of, maybe ATA has French certification for translators. That I don't know. For interpreting, in this country at least, we do not have that. Australia is getting, which I believe does have it, is getting ready to slowly start moving its interpreter test certification testing online. So in a year or two, that might be a possibility. Meantime, there is language proficiency testing. Not every company offers it. I know that Language Testing International offers French testing. And if you have a language proficiency test and start assembling a portfolio of other credentials, including letters of recommendation, including academic transcripts and everything, it's the portfolio that people will look at and take seriously, because they know that we don't have French interpreter certification at this point in time. But the language proficiency testing piece of that certificate is important. Somebody's asking, will you be sending the slides as well? Yes, 24 hours after, roughly after this point in time, you will get the recording, the link to the recording, the link to the PowerPoint slides, and the link to the to your certificate. Hi, Marjorie. The central problem of interpreter skills training is shortage of bilingual practice materials. Any available for purchase at CCC? We do have both the role plays that currently exist in 9 language pairs for both the medical interpreter online 40-hour program or the community interpreter online 40-hour program. And we are thinking of making them available as bilingual practice materials separately. So that's a relevant question that could lead us to move in that direction. In addition, we are right now examining the first audio files for the next set of programs related to remote interpreting, but it's 4 language pairs, not 9. But it is bilingual practice materials. So that's something that you will hear about the minute it is available. Looking through the what questions have I not answered? Somebody's asking if they had to take TOEFL for ECFMG MD, and I do not know what that is, so I cannot answer that question. When I attended CCC training, I saw bilingual dialogues for consecutive interpreting for quite a few languages. Later, I searched but couldn't find any audio materials on the Licensed Trainer website. Now, most of them are published materials, so many of which I think are still published. It's a lot easier to get published role plays, including a certain number in other languages, in other language pairs with English. Audio materials, I think for sale, I'm only aware of Acebo, which I think is acebo.com, ACEB as in boy, O, acebo.com. And the last I heard, and that's court interpreting. They do have Spanish for healthcare, but for the other languages, it's only for legal and court interpreting. Off the top of my head, I'm not seeing. If anyone else knows of audio materials, please feel right to write in chat or in the chat feature if you're aware of any. We would be happy to pass the word around. It is an excellent question and a real problem in the field. Somebody asked about the CCHI E2E study. We didn't have time to ask that question. I will say that as someone with a BA and Master's in linguistics, and I'm a PhD dropout in Arabic linguistics, from a long time ago. I have followed that test with interest, and I take the research behind it very, very seriously. I have from the very start. I think it's the most promising thing we've seen in the field for the answer to what do we do about all those languages that aren't the big main languages that we have certification tests for. There is going to be, and I'm one of the panelists, fair disclosure, I believe December 16th, a webinar by CCHI on exactly that topic so that you can learn more about it. Yes, December 16th from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. So go check their website, and if it's up there, it's a community conversation. So it's not like a webinar in that sense, but it is a recorded conversation of panelists on exactly that topic. Someone asked, are the examples of language tests that the speakers mentioned only available for companies to test their potential hires, or are they also available directly to individuals? And the answer is that they're directly available for the most part. The tests that they mentioned, anything that isn't government testing is mostly available either for companies to buy or for individuals to buy. Whether the prices differ, yes, prices can differ if companies have their special negotiated group, bulk volume purchase discount or whatever. So you have to go to each individual company and get their pricing. I should warn you that pricing might disappear from the presentation. Do you have good resources on the test development process? That is a question you might want to email to us, and if so, we will shoot it to them in order to get their answer from the horse's mouth and pass it on to you. It's a great question. How do these scales compare to the CEFR scale? Those, if you Google it, you can get a comparison. I apologize. If you Google ILR ACTFL CEFR comparison, you will be able to get that easily online. Sorry, so sometimes the questions jump. Hello, what is your next webinar? Someone is saying, thank you for, you said your presentations are so wonderful and helpful. That's a very sweet comment. Andrew, if you could post the date of the next webinar, it is in mid-January. I think it's, I'm trying to see if my calendar has it. The 19th, January 19th at the same time. But if Andrew, if you could post the title, because that I do not remember. Somebody is saying, oh, thank you, Ida Sarbasova. For interested candidates, she said, Australia through NATI, which is the National Association of Australian Translators and Interpreters, I believe, has interpreter accreditation practice tests in open domain. We'll have to put that in our resource section of our website. Thank you. That is wonderful information. Oh, poor Camila. I asked, when would I be able to take the oral test for medical interpreter certification in person and not online? Online services are terrible. Sorry, thank you. That is a really good question. And with Omicron just debuting on the horizon, I'm not CCHI and I'm not NBCMI, and I'm not answering for either of them, but I suspect that they themselves might not have an answer to that question. It's such a hard world to predict right now. Okay, I'm looking to see if I have missed any questions. Oh, and by the way, as Andrew has mentioned, if you do not get an email from us with the link to the recording and the PowerPoint, et cetera, in 24 hours, check your spam. We are finding that more and more things are going to spam ourselves. And when you spread the word about the recording, unfortunately, anything to do with CUs or certificates, it's only for people who attend live, but they can at least see the valuable information for free. Thank you for all your kind comments. I think I have answered all the questions I can see. So without further ado, I want to thank you all for attending, for all your questions, for your time, and for caring enough about language proficiency testing to be here with us today. Once you get the link to that recording, please share it with everyone you know and help educate the world at large and our industry of translating and interpreting in particular about the importance of language proficiency testing and how it works. Thank you, Gabe and Bill, wherever you are right now. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye for now.